So I'm going to talk today about a topic about a topic that actually I've done work on and lots of other people have done work on. So I'm going to try and coalesce the literature. And it was also the subject of Rena's dissertation, which he turned into 2 papers in JUE. So there's a little bit of her in this topic as well, but there's a lot of other people in the topic as well too. So I'm going to talk about urban form. What urban form I mean is how cities are organized internally. Okay? And traditionally, most of economics, urban economics literature is focused on the residential sector, on Ricardian rent, residential density. The story is that households living near desirable locations, whether it's workplace or the ocean, pay higher housing rent, and households who live further pay less rent, and there's some equilibrium between the value of being near it and the price of housing. And over time, the rent provides incentives to owners and developers to build at higher density, that is, build at higher density where rent is higher. And so cities should have a form where if you look at market-based residential density, it matches rent density. That's market-based. So the interesting thing I like students to compare is think about the Florida coast as opposed to the California coast. Florida coast is just completely lined with high-rise, high-density buildings. This is true in many Asian cities. The closer you get to the water, the higher things go. And in California, we really don't have market-based residential density. You have, regulatory, NIMBY residential density. And the two cities couldn't look different in terms of their coastlines, okay? But what I want to focus on today is not this residential thing at all. I want to argue that urban form is really determined by where firms decide to locate, and the people follow them. So this is really about the location of jobs. And so I'll start off with posing the question, what if there are many centers of employment, shopping, play, whatever you want to have, and the question is, how centralized will that employment be? Okay? More or less than households. What determines the level of employment concentration or centralization? What are the consequences of having employment very dispersed as opposed to very, concentrated? And to my thinking, that's completely the explanation of why LA looks like it does and New York looks like it does. Okay? They are building apartment buildings right down there that look just like New York City. Okay? But LA doesn't look anything at all like New York City. Okay? So we think. All right, so let's go on. What I did a couple of years ago was I used zip code data to tabulate up jobs by place of work at each zip code and population by place of residence, sorted by distance from some notion of a center, and then cumulated up. So these are cumulative cumulated density functions. 100% of the population lives within 70 miles of downtown LA. The solid line is employment. The dashed line is population. And what you can see is the two are completely equally centralized. Jobs, people, jobs, people, jobs, people, jobs, people, all the way out into the desert. And there's no centrality really at all. If we thought LA was some kind of monocentric city, then all the employment would rise up like this and go look like that. And if we thought people were evenly dispersed actually requires a little bit of a whoops. This is one of those things where you touch. Requires a little bit of a convex curve like that because there's more land area out here. So there's a range. This curve could look like a bunch of things. When it's like this, everything is centralized. Like this, everything is decentralized. And then there's the difference between the two. But here, the two are exactly the same. Okay? So all right, that's LA. Why don't we look at New York? Whoa, not so different. Okay? The difference between New York and LA is all within the first 10 miles. So that's Manhattan. And so, within Manhattan, you've got 35% of the jobs and only about 20% of the population. If we go back to LA, it's exactly an even 25% for both jobs and for population. So, okay, jobs are a little more centralized than population in the first 10 miles. And then for all the rest of Metro New York, it looks just like LA. Jobs, people, jobs, people, jobs. People evenly dispersed. So we played around with this notion a little bit. So let's come up with a measure of job centralization, which is, we'll go back here, and we'll take the integral, the area under each of these curves, out to this point and divide by that. And then we're going to measure between 0 and 1. And if all the jobs are in the center, like this, the integral will be approximately 55 divided by 55, and we'll get an index of 1 for complete centralization. If everything is at the edge of some city, which is sort of nonsense, but then they would all look like this, and the index would be very close to 0. And then we did that for 120 cities and lined them up here. Okay, and this is population centralization. This is employment centralization. You see it ranges from 0.5 to about 0.75, which, says there's no city like this and no city like that. They're all kind of in the middle. A couple of things. One is that the correlation between how centralized or decentralized population and jobs are is very strong. It's 0.78. Really, really strong. Second of all, against the 45-degree line, okay, jobs are always a little bit more centralized, not by a lot, but a little bit more centralized than employment. So, cities way up here have both jobs and population fairly centralized. Cities down here have them fairly dispersed. Okay, that was fun. Okay, but we don't live along a line. Or actually, it's not a line, along a radius, right, from the center out. Space is two-dimensional. So we try and think of a two-dimensional plane, and you can sort of think, maybe the way to think about this is you can have any number of clusters of employment in a two-dimensional plane, and you can imagine this varying. So at one extreme, there's one huge cluster of jobs in the center with people radiating out. And that's a monocentric city in 2 dimensions. Okay? And all work-play activity occurs there. At the other extreme, you could have all economic activity, all work and play, evenly spread around in dozens and dozens of little small subcenters. Okay? And in between, you could imagine urban form with, a finite number of mid-sized subcenters. We could call that polycentric. Okay? And if you think about, particularly during transitions, you can have an MSA that has, one big center and then a bunch of little centers and 2 medium-sized centers. You can have a range of centers of different sizes. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about things in that context, okay? And then say across this range of urban forms, from everything in one big center to things spread around in a number of centers, maybe from a large number of small to a few number of big to one, okay? And I want to think about how travel and economic behavior will be very different as you move along this range of urban form. What's very important is I'm going to develop 2 relationships between this form, centralized, polycentric, completely decentralized, 2 relationships between urban form and travel costs. They're going to be causal, and with the 2 relationships, I'm going to get a nice story about how a city winds up being one or the other. But I need 2 causal relationships. I'll call them Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2, because all of this is pretty new. So Roman numeral 1. The first thing we know about centralized employment is really based on Transportation, analysis, network analysis, which is when things are centralized, the average commute is really long, right? You got some people out here who have to get in here, some people out here who have to get in here, and the average is the average of these red commuting lines, right? The integral, actually, of the number of people living here, 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 and here, and here, and you get long commuting distances. People spending hours getting into this one friggin' place where all, economic activity takes place, okay? And then you think, all right, so that's going to generate greater aggregate travel because trips are just going to have to be longer if we all have to get to one place. Then you think about breaking the city up, you're going to a polycentric city, same area, same population, but we'll divide it up into 3 centers, right? We'll have, commute, like that. And the average commuting distance here is going to be the integral under this area. Really going to be tiny in comparison to the integral here, all right? So travel, VMT, let's call it, is going to be very much lower. Now, significantly lower. Now, the key here is an assumption. And I'd love to be able to test the assumption. I'm working on it. The assumption is that people do not cross-haul. They don't live here and work there. They live, work, and play at their subcenter. Okay? That's very, very important. If they're cross-cutting, factors that, say, well, it's really nice here, but the ocean's over here or whatever, and I'm going to, live here and go through hell, zippy, cross all these subcenters and wind up over here, then this doesn't work. Okay? Then I'm back to almost ground zero. But I have to make the assumption that there's efficient commuting, that the commuting patterns are like this. And so the first thing in urban form, this first relationship, is the greater VMT from centralization, all right, is also going to cause more congestion. You hold capacity constant. Great. This is a Solow-Vickery congestion function. The cost of travel per mile is, roughly the ratio of VMT to capacity. Okay? So now you say, if we go to a monocentric city, not only are we going to have longer commutes, but the speed of those commutes is going to be slower. Okay? So, what's going to happen is how much we have to spend getting to work is going to go up with the square of VMT. Okay? And it's going to really shoot up as we have huge single-centered cities. Even if we, move to a huge single-centered city and we start adding transportation capacity, and even if we keep speeds constant by doing that, which I don't think we can, okay, then employment will still increase travel expenditures just linearly. Okay? So I'm developing a relationship which basically says the more we concentrate everything in one center, the slower travel is going to get, the longer distances are going to get. We're going to have a significant increase in the cost of travel per mile, the speed of travel. Okay? And somebody said, oh, yeah, but you can have mass transit systems and other things. Nah, wait a minute. The London Tube is just in a state of chaos these days. It's cram-packed, all right? People can't get to work. I had a physicist once who was a colleague of mine at the gym. We used to work out together. And he sort of looked at this and he said, this is insane. You want to take 8 million, 9 million, 10 million people and all put them in one sort of central area of a couple miles in radius. And we worked it through. And he said, that means you'd have to have enough, highway capacity to be 8 levels all the way around the edge of the center. You just can't get that much to one point. It sort of defies the laws of physics. Now you can, so that's something to really consider. All right, so that's the first thing. I increase centralization, okay? What's going to happen is travel costs are going to go up, okay? Now I want to go to the second causal relationship between these two variables, and I want to flip the causality. I want to say, oh, wait a minute. is it possible that transportation costs, transportation costs per mile, also has an effect in determining the level of centralization? Okay, and I'm going to come up with a negative relationship there. It's all going to be this nice equilibrium cross where things shift and we can explain urban form. But this story, this is really a simple story. This is just traffic engineering 101. This is a much more complicated story about how travel costs can actually generate the level of employment centralization. So the way I want to think about this is to say, let's think if we have jobs and people located randomly in some way in a city. In equilibrium, what do we need? We need nobody wants to move. That's the definition of an equilibrium. No firm, no household. Okay? So in equilibrium, no one wants to change either workplace or home. For workers at a particular location, what ensures that they are indifferent to various residential locations? Well, that's the Ricardian rent. Okay, that works. For residents at a particular location, what ensures that they are indifferent to switching jobs? That they say, oh, I'm happy living here, working here, as opposed to working there. There you have to have different wages. So you have to have different wages, okay? Jobs with longer commutes and higher travel expenditures must be compensated for that extra cost with a higher wage. And so there's a little bit of quite a lot of literature arguing that you can observe in one form or another wage gradients within cities where larger employment centers, such as the CBD, have to draw workers from further distances because they're so big and have so many jobs, okay? And they have to pay more for that longer commute. And if you're in an environment where everybody's living in some little, coastal village, smaller live, work, and play, sub-center, you don't have to have that higher wage. You can have a lower wage. So this is directly from Rena's thesis, which is directly from Michelle White's paper in '76. So here we have a big center, and we have a little center, and we have the rent gradient for residential, which reflects the cost of commuting per mile, which is this slope. And these guys commute this distance, and in the big center, they commute this longer distance. The total cost of commuting is, this distance here versus this distance here, and the wage premium is right there. That's the extra pay you have to, pay your workers to get them to work here, as opposed to getting them to work there, okay? And not only that, the price of land, like this, is going to be higher here too. So firms will have to use a little land when they build their facilities or factories. So, firm rents are going to have to be higher here, as well as wages. So firms are going to get doubly hit by locating in this center as opposed to this center, or by staying in this center, whatever it is. They're going to have to pay higher wages, and they're going to have to pay higher land rents underneath their offices, underneath their shopping, underneath their facilities, okay? So, here I'm just, illustrating that. I'm gonna go back, I'm just saying, this little worker here is a very pivotal guy, okay? Because he's paying the same for housing whether he works here or here. So to be indifferent, that's why he has to have a higher wage here or here. And notice that as he moves this way, he's getting compensated by rent. He pays higher rent to reduce this commute. He moves this way, he pays higher rent to reduce that commute. And you have, in a sense, a complete equilibrium in this sort of city. Now, let's put some numbers on this. How important is the wage difference as opposed to the difference in the cost of land, all right, for firms in choosing this center versus that center, okay? So the rent, typically 200 square feet per worker, is usually $15, $20, $30. Works out to a number like a couple $1,000 more. The cost per worker here is a couple $1,000 more because the space you have to put that worker in is more expensive, okay? The wage, I'm going to argue, is like 3 or 4 times that. $13,000, $14,000, $15,000. And I could sort of develop a theoretical argument about that, but we actually did a study on it 15 years ago. A couple papers came out of that, and we looked at 4 MSAs using detailed census data. We estimated earnings equations for, hundreds of thousands of workers. This is back when you actually had the long form, and you could get the 5% micro-sample data. And we put in fixed effects for where the worker worked. We didn't care about where he lived. We cared everything about what kind of worker it was. We stratified the equations. We knew the education, the race, the sex experience, and everything else. And then the question was, where did you work? One of 24, at that point, place of work PUMA zones in the census. Okay, what we found is observationally equivalent workers with 43 variables in our earnings equation, all right, could earn effectively about 15% different wages, annual earnings, depending on where they worked. So where do you think they got paid the most? In Boston, right there. So this is the discount they got paid off of Boston. This is the log earnings equation, depending upon where they worked. And it gets to be about 15%. Okay, they work at the edges in some small little edge city, they get paid 15% less. And we did this for 4 cities, very different cities, Chicago, Houston, and Los Angeles. Okay, and we got the same results. Actually, Houston, the premium got up to be 20%. If you worked at some small little subcenter in Houston, you got 20% less than if you worked in downtown Houston in the Enron building, something like that. So it was, it was a very common story across, there were different numbers, everything would look different, different geography, but the results were always the same. And it lined up so that we said, all right, what is the average commute for all the people that work in each of these 24 places? And here it is, okay? Boston is longest. Wages are what? Highest. And the places that have the shortest commute have the lowest wages. And it all works out exactly like this diagram says it's supposed to, okay? All right, now if that's all there was to this story, this is a really long story to get to this one relationship that we need to sort of close the urban form discussion, okay? So if the world is really like that, why don't all firms go to small centers? Okay, they're going to save. We just showed you some data. They'll save, 15% on wages, and they'll save another 5% on space costs per worker. That's 20%. You see companies going to Dallas or other cities to save 20% on labor costs. I'm saying all you have to do is what? Go to a small subcenter as opposed to be downtown. Okay, so you need some productivity, some kind of agglomeration effect that says, basically, it's worth it to be here, okay? Because here still exists, it's doing pretty well down there, actually. And what is the, what's the agglomeration effect? So we have a literature on that. And you go back to Marshall said that firms of the same type share information, ideas, if they were in proximity to each other. What about non-competes? You're Wall Street and you come up with a new derivative. You can't, and you work for Morgan Stanley, you can't go run over to Goldman and say, hey, we came up with this really great thing and you can arbitrage it and play with it. Firms are not academics. Okay.
How many advanced non-compete clauses in employment contracts?
But what's
you can't share trade secrets, but you can move from Google.
If you go over to, you go over, but if you carry that information and get it, you can be still sued, privately sued. Non-compete, okay, isn't allowed. But if I'm with Google and I come up with some software and I go over and share it, Google can still sue me. I signed a contract saying, even with a non-compete, I signed a contract saying the things I develop here belong to Google. They don't belong to me. I can't go off and set up a firm with it. If I do, they'll sue me. Okay? Private suits are very threatening. Okay, so that's the first thing. Then there's another argument. I'm arguing, if you go look at Kendall Square, where there's 25 million square feet of biotech space, all these companies trying to find a virus vaccine. Okay, the first one that gets it is going to have a big prize. He can't take off and say, I'm going to take this, vaccine formula over here and build my own company and become a billionaire. No. That belongs to Biogen, where it belongs to whoever you work for. Okay, so. The second argument is, maybe what causes clustering is firms of different types, but that do business with each other, like to locate together. This is kind of some kind of vertical integration argument. And I say, but we're in the age of the internet. We communicate with our suppliers and buyers remotely. Transportation costs are really small. I don't buy that argument. The argument that I really buy is the labor market argument. And here's the way that argument goes. Okay? You get a bunch of firms who are in the same industry together. Okay? Workers can switch jobs more easily. You can go to the guy down the street, get a higher pay because you're more productive there doing, his version of what you're doing now. Okay? You don't even have to move your residence. You just come home one night and say, hi, I increased my salary 30% by moving down the street. Economists think that those moves are almost always productivity enhancing. All right, there's a paper in the JUE in 2006 that shows pretty convincingly that workers working in dense labor markets switch jobs more often. They really do. They flip jobs more often. And that's pretty convincing. Okay, so maybe that's what's going on. Put all the biotech people together, they'll be moving around and they'll match better eventually and we'll get more output. But the flip side for the firms is you lose somebody and you have to fill a vacancy. Where do you find that vacancy if you're in a dense labor market? Right next door. You put out a for hire sign and you eventually get a worker from the... So the labor market really works well in occupations when you have lots of firms using the same workers clustering together. It's a labor market agglomeration. Now, one interesting counterexample, so Rebitzer winds up saying that when workers work in dense labor markets, they switch jobs more often. Dense labor markets are like, downtowns or in a financial district or a biotech district. There's a study done by Shilton in 1999, way back then, that shows that headquarters, corporate campuses, always locate at the edge of cities. It actually has data showing you look at the Fortune 500, you look where their headquarters are, you put it on a map, and none of them are in downtowns. They're almost all at the edges of cities in corporate campuses. And so he winds up saying, the reason you do that is because they have no turnover. And it's true, corporate headquarters have lots of what we call lifers, people that stay with the corporation for a long period of time. So they go to the edge of the city and they bring their workers with them, and the workers find housing and they cluster right around the insurance company or the factory, whatever it is, and they're able to get very low commutes, and with very low commutes, they're able to be paid less. Okay, so here's a simple model that analyzes all this. And this is actually Bob Helsley, I think, is the guy that first came up with this model. Let's examine on this axis some hypothetical, variation in employment centralization. Here we have, infinite decentralization, zero centralization, dozens of little live-work play centers. So we move over this way, we go to one big center. Okay? Now, if there's agglomeration, productivity here should be low and productivity here should be high. But I want to use the inverse of productivity. Rather than looking at output per worker, I want to look at the number of workers we need to produce each unit of output. And that's going to go like this. We're really efficient here with our agglomeration. We were out in the remote woods here, and we have very inefficient workers, okay? So then you say, this is how many workers we need to produce output as a function of urban form. What's the cost of the workers? All right, well, if we're out here, we have some baseline cost of wage when there's no commute. If we force all our workers into a big center, we're going to have to pay them more. All right? And remember, as we move this way, centralization increases, VMT increases. Okay, the cost per mile of transportation, that may increase too. I'm going to keep that fixed for the moment and just say this is purely linear. So the wage rate we have to pay workers rises as we move this way, but the number of workers we need to produce each unit of output goes down. We take the product of the two, and we have the cost of doing business. The cost of producing a unit of output in terms of labor costs, that's the main cost of stay. And, you know, if the things look like this, that's U-shaped, like this. I'm not a very good artist with PowerPoint. I could have got a nice curve. So you look at this, you go, all right, somewhere right around here is the sort of efficient level of employment centralization to have, where we're trading off, as we go this way, we're more efficient, fewer workers per output, but you know, commuting costs are getting higher and higher. We have to pay those workers more, and we trade those two off, and we get something like that. This is all the office buildings in LA. Okay, a million square footers, quarter and half a million square footers. They're pretty well clustered. We got that cluster, that cluster. I don't know whether this is close enough to constitute a cluster. Once you're trying to identify spatially clusters of buildings, you can do this for office and industrial, you get into like DB clustering algorithms. It's complicated, but we would like to see, you know, the hypothesis is these guys out here are getting paid less workers because they're drawing workers from some little circle around there, whereas these guys here are paying higher workers because they're drawing workers from a bigger area. All right, so let's think about this, let's close this loop and think about the second relationship between travel costs and urban form. What we want to do is go back here and say, how would the solution here vary, okay, as we change travel costs? Because remember, the first thing we did is we said, as centralization increases, travel costs increase. So now, and that's causally, that's urban form determining travel costs. I've got all the ingredients here I need now to say there's a second relationship where travel costs determine urban form. Okay, that's the solution to this graph. And let's go over here. Here it is. So if I do something to lower travel costs per mile, capacity, technology, whatever it is, okay, what happens is this line rotates like this. I take the product again, and I get a line that goes like that, and the efficient city moves in which direction? Towards centralization, okay? So you can think of it in the following. You reduce the marginal cost of travel. You give households greater flexibility about where to live because it's easy to travel. So residentially, you see decentralization, okay? But the better transportation also reduces the wage premium that firms have to pay if they concentrate, because it's no longer so bad commuting all of that distance to the big CBD, okay? And so firms centralize because the way I like to think about it is the opportunity cost of achieving whatever productivity advantage there is from centralization is now lower because the cost of travel is lower. Let's take a little facetious thing. So we invent the teleporter from Star Trek. Anybody still watch Star Trek? Okay. What does that thing do? It moves you, right, in instant speed from one point to another. Okay. So what does that do to travel costs? Brings them right down to zero. Okay. And then this thing falls. All you have is productivity. So if that was really true, I'm pretty sure a mathematician who's much better than I am could come up with an actual model that would say, well, this is a limiting case where we all work in one big what? center with infinite agglomeration, all right? And we live where? Wherever you want. Wherever you want, on the beach.
We leave our bodies at home and we transfer our minds to the
You can't, no. You just, and you say, well, but what about getting together for play? Fine, we have our little restaurant list. Where do we want to eat tonight? Well, we eat there. Call up 10 friends. In 5 seconds, we're there. Okay? So this is like the Jetsons. Okay? All works takes place in one. So that's the extreme. Okay? As you start to bring, travel costs basically down to zero. All right, now let's try and think about some recent events, recent changes, which are actually reducing travel costs, I would argue. The first is electric vehicles. All right, their operating cost, including everything, repairs, fuel, and whatever, is 25% of that of internal combustion cars. It really is. They last longer. They're so much cheaper to charge at night. You talk about range anxiety, but they actually, it's really nice to be able to refuel your car right off your living room window. And so they are really a hugely better mousetrap and a huge reduction in the marginal cost of driving. They wear out less. Really, really a big improvement.
So does that include depreciation? Since you said worn out less, is that?
They wear out less too. Absolutely.
But given how expensive they are in the first place.
No. Just wait another year or two.
All right.
You have a Chevy Bolt now that with it's $35,000 car, and it's going to last 300,000 miles with almost no maintenance except for tires. No oil, no brake pads aren't going to wear out. It's regenerative braking. There's all these studies. I mean, we have transportation people at MIT. They all study this. Say 25%. 25%. The marginal cost of driving is going down by 25%, just in the next couple of years. Autonomous driving offers you the promise of a robot chauffeur. Okay? So time spent in the car should be far less onerous. That's one of the reasons people like ride hailing. There's still the car, but you don't have to drive. Okay? But it's expensive to use ride hailing because you got to pay the driver. Once you get a robot car, you've got a chauffeur for a incremental fixed cost. Okay? Autonomous driving also offers the promise of better vehicle coordination. That can greatly increase the capacity of the existing street system if you can coordinate vehicles. That means faster travel. The last one I like is, we're all going to buy things on the internet, I think. All of our goods. Services we'll get in person at places. We're going to buy all our goods on the internet. The average store purchase, this is out of the National Highway Transportation survey, uses 7.8 vehicle miles to get it home. The average UPS delivery truck uses 0.6 vehicle miles per package to get it to your door. Those actually come from UPS numbers. And you think about that. That means I'm using 1/10 as much travel to buy a dress, get a sofa. If I order it from Wayfair or somebody.com, as opposed to going to some supermarket or furniture store and spending my time, I'm not even considering the value of time. This is really amazing, okay? So that, we take that travel off the road because UPS is delivering it. That's one more thing that reduces travel, okay? So all this stuff reduces the cost of travel. Now, before we get to the final line, so it reduces the cost of travel, so we're back here, okay? Moving towards centralized employment, decentralized workplace, residences. Now, there's one other thing that people have done with this diagram, which is to think a little bit about any kind of change from information technology or computers that reduces the agglomeration benefits of clustering, because you work remotely, you have teleconferences, you have common data platforms, and we all work, on the road at home and do things. And so that may increase. And how do you think about that? Well, what that does is it rotates this line down flatter. What it says is being out here isn't quite as unproductive relative to being in a concentrated agglomeration economy as it used to be, where all the business had to be done in person, managing the people Now you can do stuff remotely. So it flattens that. What that does is, tilt this down like this, and the efficient urban form moves more in this direction towards live, work, play villages, because you can do everything from your little live, work, play village. Okay? All right. Now we put it together. Okay, we have our first relationship between travel cost per mile and centralization. Centralization is causing higher travel cost per mile. That's this black line, right? The second relationship, which was the 8 or 9 slides we developed, was the opposite. That said, as travel costs go down, okay, firms move centrally. So that's this line, okay? So now I've got a point here, okay, where I can say, all right, I've got 2 schedules, 2 simultaneous relationships between the 2 variables. I mean, some big model, a much fancier model, would actually solve for that and say, all right, that's our equilibrium point. But there are a couple of shifts going on. So if I do something to improve highway capacity or travel technology, it's like increasing capacity. What we actually do is shift this schedule down. Okay, what happens is I move from there to there. So I get more centralization, but of course more centralization is going to increase traffic volume, but I've already taken account of that. That's this slope. That's why it's a simultaneous relationship. So rather than going this way, I go like that, and that's what happens to urban form. Or if I have my green-colored increase in the ability to work at home remotely with less agglomeration, then I'm shifting this curve, that was the complicated one, this way, okay? I still have to, as I move decentralized, I'm also changing the traffic flow, but that's picked up by here. So I move from, let's see, where was I? Here to here, okay? And I can imagine all sorts of, permutations. Okay, so wrapping it up. Firms prefer higher productivity from central clustering, but they have to pay higher wages. Monocentric cities, therefore, are structured around long commutes, higher wages, but higher productivity from agglomeration to justify the higher wages. Live, work, play villages, at the other extreme, right? Everybody's got a little short commute, lower wage justified by the fact that their, productivity is lower, okay, but their sort of net utility could be the same, right, from the loss of firm agglomeration. So I should get a couple of empirical hypotheses out of this, which are really difficult to test. First one would be we should see monocentric cities where and when transportation costs are low and agglomeration is strong. Cities that have industries that really benefit from agglomeration and they have great transportation systems, okay, they should be monocentric. So cities should be more dispersed, polycentric, or even live, work, play villages when transportation is expensive, time-consuming, and when agglomeration is weak, okay? Now, I give this at MIT a few weeks ago, and the architects, cities are all determined by history. There's enough of this, enough of this economics crap. It's all history, okay? So how many of you have read this paper by Steve Redding and 2 of his colleagues, Making the Modern Metropolis, London? Have you read it? Yeah. Okay. You know what? That paper is so elegant. They have access to all this census data in London where everybody lived and worked in 1800, in 1820, and 1840. I think they go up to like 1890 or 1900. And there they draw it. And they use the Rossi-Hansberg general equilibrium model, which is really complicated. I'm not sure it works, but they're using it. And the story that comes out from the model is exactly the story of slides 17 and 18. Okay? What they say is pre-1840, London was a series of neighborhoods, small shops, small fabricators. Those working there also lived very close by. Land use was intermingled. And the reason was travel was pathetic. There was all these narrow little corridors, and you had to walk. You were driving a car. The carts were almost cumbersome. It was just getting around in London in 1840 was totally tedious. Okay? Post 1840, you had two inventions going on. The first was they started with rail. They built radial rail lines in. Then they added subways, so people could start living apart from their work and not have to walk. You know, walking is really expensive, right? 2 miles an hour, value of time. You know, at 2 miles an hour, the hour-long commute takes, 25% of your wage, potential wage. Walking is terrible. So real commuting began after these transportation improvements. And the second thing that happened is after 1840, the Industrial Revolution starts up. You have economies to scale, and firms have more of a reason to cluster to take advantage of industrial scale economies, and also because now the transportation system has permitted their workers to commute. And it's a really tour de force that says not only is all this stuff going on now, but it went on 150 years ago. And it explains how London's form evolved from pre-1840 to 1900. So, that's kind of a framework. There are a lot of people who put effort into this besides me in terms of articles and papers. But it's a way of thinking about urban form. In a monocentric world, where all employment is at one center, you know that both spouses are going to work at the same point, right? So you can carpool. And that really cuts transportation costs by a lot. In a polycentric live, work, play village, it's going to be very difficult for spouses to work at the same center, just because the centers are going to have fewer job opportunities, and the accountants will be over here and the biotech people will be over here, and if your husband is an accountant and you're a biotech person, well, there's your dual commute. Whereas if accounting and biotech are all in one big center, then you've solved the problem. So I think that's how I look at that. That's probably a plus for centralized employment, right? But not necessarily centralized residences, right? You could still, if you have low, cheap transportation, you could still live out there in the burbs, have your wonderful thing, but when you're carpooling in your electric vehicle, automated driving car, this is not a commute at all. This is just another hour-long time to spend with your spouse having fun or working or whatever you want to do. So I think that's how it would lead. It would tend to generate centralized employment, but not necessarily centralized residences. In a multi-dimensional locational surface where what matters is something in addition to how close you live to work, you would pick your subcenter, right, to be near the beach or the mountains or, or the sports stadium. Right, we got all sorts of people building apartments over there. They must be basketball lovers. And so they're gonna live there. So that, in some sense, can come into play. The more factors you have determining where people want to live, then it becomes just, hopelessly complex. If there are 5 or 6 or 7 factors, then it becomes very, very complex. The architects I give this to, they always say, I don't want to live in a little live, work, play village. There's nothing to do there. I want to be downtown where there are 49 Chinese restaurants and 68 Korean restaurants and 5 ballets and 3 sports stadiums. And you know what? People actually don't use that much agglomeration. 1 Chinese restaurant, 2 Korean restaurants, a couple French restaurants, 1 movie theater, 3 or 4 art galleries. What's the little beach town next to UC Irvine? What?
Laguna?
What?
Laguna?
Laguna.
Where Carrie lives.
Yeah, where Carrie lives, I had a client as a woman who worked for real estate for MetLife, and she moved there, and she said she was amazed at how much she could do within 3 miles of Laguna Beach. And it's just a small little subset, 50,000, 75,000 people in that area. And it was remarkably sophisticated and fun. And she said, if I have to go to a Lakers game once a month or something like that, well, then I'll just commute. But my daily commuting for food, kids, school, work is all in the environs of that subcenter, okay? If they're well organized. I have a student who's building new towns in Indonesia. He's very involved in the project that's going to relocate the capital. And also, if you look at Jakarta's evolved enormously into 6, 7, 8 sub-centers on big highways and transit lines that run around the old downtowns. They're on higher land, okay? And companies love this. They say, I'm going to put my insurance company, my bank here. I'm going to have all the foreign workers. I'm going to provide them with restaurants and schools, and the next thing you know, there's an edge city, so to speak, on the outskirts of Indonesia, of Jakarta, with 50, 100,000 workers, a bunch of office buildings, shopping, movie theaters, a whole bunch of stuff, and you talk to the people that live there, and they go, this is really nice. I mean, it's not. It's really nice living. It's got all sorts of things that I would. It doesn't have, 39 Chinese restaurants. It's only got 4 or 5, but it has everything really close, and I don't need to spend 20% of my day commuting into the big CBD.